Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. So today we present our second keynote speaker of the conference, Professor César Hidalgo. He is original from Chile, well, he studied physics there, the degree of physics in Pontificia University there, and then he moved to the States, concretely to Indiana, I think, for the PhD, also in physics. And then he started to contribute in quite different areas, it seems, like economic complexity, visualization of data, for instance, is very important for his career, and then also things connected to artificial intelligence. But all those quite different stuffs are quietly connected, I think, according to what he says is the idea of understanding and explaining how, as far as I understood, collectives and collectives in a wide sense like societies, cities, teams, even countries, how do they learn, okay? Now he as you see on the slide, on the presentation slide, he is the leader of the Collective Learning Center at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute of Toulouse. And he was been there since 2019. And prior to this, he was directing a similar center linked to the MIT in Massachusetts, called exactly the same, the Collective Learning Center there. He was there for 9-10 years, and prior to that, he had been involved in different positions in different places, including Harvard University, as far as I see. And he's now also honorary professor in Manchester, I think. And he has been awarded with several awards, like maybe the most important one is the Lagrange Prize, which is awarded by the Laboratory of Complex Systems in Italy, I think. Yeah. And well, he has contributed with many papers on different areas linked to this general idea that he will probably explain better than me. And he also has written 3 books that have been very much cited and even translated to different languages, I think. Their names are, the first one was The Atlas of Economic Complexity in 2014. The second one was Why Information Grows in 2015. And the third one is entitled How Humans Use Machines, that was presented in 2021, so during the pandemic. Maybe you were thinking about machines and humans because of that, because we were a bit isolated, I don't know. You will know?
It takes longer to write.
Yeah, I know, but okay, yeah, sure. So as you see from the title of the conference, this is exactly the title of today, and it seems that it is focused on the idea of comparing reactions of people to actions according to whether the actions are performed or conducted by either humans or some kind of artificial intelligence. So this is the result of some research, empirical research, as far as I understand, in this regard. So I hope you enjoy very much the talk. So I give you the floor, César. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, and thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to tell you about my latest book, which is How Humans Judge Machines. This is a book that appeared a little bit over a year ago with MIT Press. And what the book does is it explores how people react to the actions of machines and humans. What we wanted to understand is if people judge humans and machines equally, or if we judge them differently. Is it simply that we have a preference for humans over machines? Or is there something more complicated going on? Are there, for instance, different moral philosophies at play? So the setup of the book is quite simple. What we did was conduct a series of experiments that are randomized control trials. These are basically like clinical studies in which we take a population and we divide that population randomly into two groups. So we assign people randomly, let's say this half of the room, you're all gonna look at the same question, but we're gonna present that question to you as if it was the action of a machine. And then we're gonna present that same question to people in this side of the room as if that question was the action of a human. And then we're gonna compare your answers. And what that allows us to do is to basically have causal inference, because since we randomly assign you to each one of those conditions, we can infer that the differences in the answers that we get, are due to the manipulation that we did. One group saw that question as the action of a machine, and another one as the action of a human. So we're gonna ask the question, well, if a machine and a human do the same thing, do they get the same reaction? If they make the same mistake, do they get the same type of punishment? Now, this question is interesting, but it's not so much a question about machines. It's more of a question of how we perceive them, okay? Because at the end of the day, it's not the machine the one that is good or bad. It is us the one that are gonna be attributing that positive or negative character to that machine. And the book is gonna be based on scenarios. So I'm gonna start by telling you a little bit about the methodology, how we collected the data, and I'm gonna use an example which is very simple and involves an excavator that is working on a construction site, and unbeknown to the driver, this site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave, digs through it, and later people find human remains. So this is a scenario that could be very much the action of an autonomous excavator. There's an autonomous excavator that is, let's say, programmed to dig a site, or an excavator operated by a human. And the question is, well, would people judge this excavator differently if it was an autonomous excavator or if it was an excavator operated by a human? So we asked people to react to these scenarios, using, in this case, 11 questions. We asked, was the action harmful? And they had to rate this action in a scale, in a Likert scale from 1 to 10. Would you hire this driver for a similar position? Would you consider this action to be intentional? Do you like the driver? How morally wrong or right was the action? Do you agree that the driver should be promoted? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced by a robot or an algorithm? This is the replaced by different questions, so if we were asking it in the case of the machine condition, do you agree that the machine should be replaced by a human driver? Okay? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced by another person? Or do you agree that the machine should be replaced by another machine, so replaced by the same type? Do you think the driver is responsible for unearthing the grave? And if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the estimates that we obtain at the population level for the answers for each one of these questions. So, for instance, in this excavator scenario, you start noticing that there are a few differences, going forward, red is always gonna indicate data about machines, so you can think that red is for robots, and blue is gonna indicate data about humans. And you see, for instance, that in the harm dimension, people see more harm in an autonomous excavator digging up a grave than in a human excavator digging up a grave. Why would that be? The difference is not that strong, but it's still significant. It's a p-value of around 10 to the minus 4. The people also find that it's much more morally incorrect for an autonomous machine to dig up an excavator than for a human that doesn't know that the grave is there to dig it up. So we conducted two types of data collections. The first one, was about people's reaction. Another one was about the scenario itself. When we think about morality, we have to understand that in moral psychology, people think of scenarios of moral transgressions or moral dilemmas in the context of moral foundation theory. This is a theory that says that morality has certain dimensions. Some scenarios, for instance, would trigger the moral dimension of harm if there's someone that is physically hurt. Other ones, might trigger the moral dimension of fairness if there's an uneven, or unfair distribution. Other ones involve breaches of loyalty or disrespect of authority. Some even involve, violations of purity. So what we do is we run a separate data collection scenario, experiment in which we present people with these scenarios and we ask them to associate them with words that connect to each one of these categories. And for instance, in the excavator scenario, what do you think we get? Which type of moral transgression? You know, nobody's hurt because you are digging up a grave, so it cannot be harm. It's not particularly unfair, to dig up a grave. There's nothing about fairness involved, nothing about loyalty, no authority, but there's something sacred about the human body. If, the excavator would have digged up a refrigerator or a chicken carcass, it wouldn't be a problem, yeah? But there's something about the human body that we hold sacred, whether we are religious or not, and therefore, this is a scenario that triggers the moral dimension of purity, and that's, basically what the data tells us. This is a purity scenario. So now that you understand the methodology, let's look at some scenarios that are a little bit more complicated. Consider a large tsunami that is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. There's a politician or an algorithm, depending whether you are in the treatment or the control group, that is responsible for the safety of this town and can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success, or say 50% of the town with 100% success. So this is a setup that has three possible outcomes. In the first outcome, the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. So this is a scenario that involves the moral dimension of harm and fairness, because of course people here are in physical danger, but on the other hand, you have to choose whether you're saving some people or not, and that introduces that dimension of fairness. So we're going to call a scenario S2, like the unlucky situation. You try to run the risk, you try to save everyone, but you fail. Then there is another possible outcome which would give us a scenario S3, which is that the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone and the rescue effort succeeds. Everyone is saved. That's the luckiest scenario. You tried to save everyone, it was a gamble, but you won. And then you have a scenario S4, which is that the politician or algorithm decides to take the compromise, and in that case, there's no uncertainty, we know what the outcome is. So let's look at the reactions. So we're going to start here from your right, and you see that when we present the compromise scenario, we don't see a lot of big differences. People see the same level of harm, there's no significant difference in how morally right or wrong people think the scenario is. There's a big difference in the replaced by different question, but to be honest, machines almost always lose by a landslide on that question. So people always want to replace the machine, more than they want to replace the human. So basically, the machine that took the compromise would be replaced by a human. The human that took the compromise would not be replaced by a machine. But for the most part, the differences are quite small. We also see a small difference there in the intention dimension. People see the action of the human as more intentional. That might seem obvious, but then we'll see that it's not always the case. Now, let's look at the scenario in which you try to save everyone and succeed. So this is a positive scenario. This is not a disaster. You were able to save everyone, so nobody was hurt here. And what you find here is that people evaluate the machine and the human positively, but they evaluate the human much more positively than they evaluate the machine, don't they? People report liking the human more, so the blue is to the right of the red. They find the action of the human to be more morally correct. The action, of course, was the same. The outcome also was the same. They want to hire the human more than they would want to hire that machine that got it right. They want to promote the human more and so forth. They still want to replace the machine that got it right quite a lot, So not as much as before, but they still want to replace it. And they see, of course, that there was no harm, so there's no significant difference in that dimension as well. But basically here what we're seeing is that in this case, the scenario was positive, but the human is getting more credit than the machine. Yeah? So they both got it right. The machine is taking a little bit for granted. The human, is actually being rewarded. And now we move to the lucky scenario where you try to save everyone and fail. And this is where we see the largest differences. Okay, so here we see, for instance, a strong, significant difference in the dimension of harm. People think that the machine that tried to save everyone and failed caused more harm than the human that tried to save everyone and failed. People actually want to hire again the human that tried and failed. They don't want to hire again the machine that tried and failed. And when it comes to intention, when the machine got it right and the human got it right, or when they took the compromise, people attributed more intention to the human. Here, in some way, the difference is not as strong. It's not even significant. Basically, they're seeing this more of an accident, so they attribute a similar level of intention to the human than to the machine. People report liking the human more. They find the action of the human to be more morally correct. They want to promote the human. So here we see a big difference, even more than when they got it right. And this starts to hint to something deeper going on, which is maybe it's not just a simple preference of people for humans and against machines, but maybe there are some different moral philosophies at play. Because in this scenario S2, what we're starting to see is that the human is being judged for trying. The human is trying to save everyone. Their heart is in the right place, so we're judging their intention, their motivation. The machine is not being judged for what was trying to accomplish, for trying to save everyone, is being judged by the outcome, which is that in this case, a failure. Intention is in fact a very important component of moral judgment. In fact, it factors strongly in criminal law. Consider these two scenarios, in this case now involving only humans. There are two colleagues at work, Alice and Bob, that work in this software company. They're competing for a promotion at work, and Alice has a severe peanut allergy. Knowing about this allergy, Bob sneaks into the office kitchen and mixes a large spoonful of peanut butter into her soup. At lunchtime, Alice accidentally drops her soup on the floor, after which she decides to go out for lunch. She suffers no harm. So in scenario A, Bob was trying to get Alice, poisoned. Yeah? In scenario B, Alice and Bob are the same two colleagues. Alice also has a peanut allergy. Bob, in this case, doesn't know about it and takes her out for lunch, brings her a peanut butter sandwich. She takes a big bite. She suffers a reaction. She goes to the hospital. So in scenario B, there was harm that there was no intention to harm. And, basically, like the theory, would tell you that in scenario A, where there was no harm but there was intention to harm, we are in presence of something that is worse than in scenario B, when there was no intention to harm, but harm may have been caused. So what we're going to do is we're going to start formalizing these ideas, and we're going to start creating functions, using this data. They're going to try to predict how wrong a scenario is as a function of dimensions, not just intention, but the intention in the scenario, whether there was harm, whether the moral dimension involved was fairness or involved a violation of loyalty. What are the characteristics of the subjects involved in performing the action, or in receiving the action, and so forth. And we're going to get to that by the end of the presentation. For now, let's look at a little bit more data. So since we are in Milan, I want to use a fashion example. A fashion company wants a new advertisement that illustrates addiction to clothes and fashion. So you can think that this is actually an example of a real advertisement that was controversial, but you can think that this could have been generated with DALL-E or one of these other models that are very popular today. The company employs a marketeer or an AI marketing system to design the ad that uses the concept of addiction as its main message. The resulting advertisement, causes shock and outrage in members of the public. So there is like a media backlash. Okay. We have other examples. These are also examples that actually are real. This is a campaign from Benetton. The one on top is a campaign from a transportation company in Cardiff that didn't last too long. Actually, it was removed after about 48 hours, because of course the ad, was not, very sensitive. How people react to these scenarios? Well, they don't see a lot of difference in this case when it comes to harm, you know? They don't see a lot of difference when it comes to wanting to hire, you know, this human marketeer or this AI marketing system. They, you know, evaluate them the same. They see the action of the human as more intentional, but they don't see the action of the machine or the human to be more morally right or wrong than the other one. Where we do see a big difference is in the dimensions of responsibility down here. And there's a particular question that we have here, you know, which asks people to tell us who should respond to the public. Should the agent respond to the public, or should the organization respond to the public? You know? So in some sense, if you are in a company and you have an AI system, and that AI system is involved in some controversy or mistake, you know, who are people going to go after? Are they going to go after the big bosses of the company, or go after the brand, the CEO, and so forth? Or, you know, like, do you have like some sort of firewall with a team that you can assign responsibility to? And what we find here is that basically, as you move into the machine scenario, you know, the responsibility is not of the agent, it's that of the organization. And it moves towards that. So as you know, introduce AI into, you know, systems, basically you're going to shift organization to a more corporate level. It's not going to be about a team, a unit, you know, it's going to be a responsibility of an organization, and that's what we learn from those scenarios. Now, let's look at a self-driving car scenario. So here we have a self-driving car scenario in which a car on a sunny spring day, you know, that is working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. The pedestrian is hurt and is taken to the hospital. So this is a harm scenario, you know, and it's a scenario also in which the machine or the driver was not at fault. It was the pedestrian, the one that jumps in front of the vehicle. Yeah? So how did people react to that scenario? Well, they see more harm again in the action of the machine. They want to replace the self-driving machine, not necessarily, you know, the human driver for a self-driving machine. They like the human driver more than the machine. But where we see something weird is in that intention dimension. That intention dimension, it's very much to the left of the scale, but this time it flipped. Now, they attribute more intention to the machine than to the human. Not because they're saying that the action of the machine is intentional. By the way, you guys need to get a new microphone, huh? But not because they say that the actions of the machine are intentional, but because they're willing to excuse the human much more. And since the human gets completely excused, basically, you know, the action reverse. Now, if I were to revert this, you know, and try different variations, I can try variations, for instance, in which, you know, I consider a dog as the victim instead of a human. More or less everything looks the same, you know. The only difference is that you see harm moves a little bit to the left because a dog is a victim with lower moral status than a human, you know, but still involves harm. Or I can use wind to blow a branch off a tree and cause an accident, you know. The results are the same, and in all of them you see that machines are seen as more intentional than, you know, humans. So can we think about machines having some level of, you know, intention or agency? That sounds weird, no? It sounds weird, yeah? But fortunately, I'm not the first one to think about it. You know, actually in moral philosophy and, you know, behavioral psychology, people have thought about, you know, the intention of machines and the mental models that we make of machines, you know? And the way to think about this is to think about, you know, agency and status and all of these dimensions as a continuum. You know, so a rock clearly has no agency. An adult human, you know, has agency and therefore is morally responsible for their actions. You can take them to trial, you know. What about an 8-year-old? Well, an 8-year-old is not the same as an adult. Yeah? If an 8-year-old grabs a gun and shoots someone, do you send them to like grown-up jail? Of course not, you know, because they are not at that level of moral responsibility. What about a 2-year-old? What about a dog? You know? So agency is actually part of a continuum. And when you think of a machine that has the ability to learn, a machine that has the ability to plan, that has the ability to memorize, has some sort of level of agency that is also somewhere in that continuum. So it's not like a rock, it's not like a toaster, it's something that actually has more agency. And you can think of a machine, for instance, that is designed to protect a driver at all costs, or designed to protect a pedestrian at all costs. And based on that design, they take a different action in an uncertain situation. Well, the machine didn't intend to cause whatever it caused, but it was working as intended, So in some sense, the machine had agency on decide a course of action, even though it was not able to have agency to decide a goal. If the machine was able to decide both the goal and the course of action, the agency would be larger. So if you look at this paper from 2007 from Gray et al. In Science, they look at the agency and experience of machines. They look at how people perceive machines compared to humans, babies, fetuses, and so forth. And when you map the mental model that people have of these different entities, you see that machines are seen as agents with no moral status, So no sentiency, no matter what that Google guy said. No sentience in the machine. But they're seen as having some sort of level of agency. And this is an old paper. This is from 2007. This is when machines were not as smart as they are today. So there is some validity to the idea, and we've actually been building now on this, on some more recent papers, to the fact that there is some component of agency on machines. It might feel counterintuitive, but agency is not something that you either have or not. It's part of a continuum, and machines, are at that intermediate level of agency. Now, one question that I think many people might have is like, well, maybe what you have, Cesar, here is the fact that just people don't like robots. Some people like people, So can we find a scenario in which people rate machines better than human? Because so far, machines are either ranked worst or evaluated worse or the same. But we haven't found a scenario in which machines, are ranked better or judged better than humans. So I'm going to borrow a scenario from Jonathan Haidt, which is one of the fathers of moral foundation theory. And this is a scenario in which you have a family, who has a cleaner, that in our case could be a robot or a human, that is in charge of cleaning their house. One day the family finds that the cleaner robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. So it's kind of like a weird scenario, because it doesn't involve harm. It involves like some sort of weird combination of loyalty, because the national flag is a symbol that you should be loyal, but also it's a symbol of authority. And there's something sacred about it, Actually, it's quite controversial, there was a vote in the United States, many years ago in the Senate, in which by one vote, the free speech protected the right to burn the flag, in the 90s, because it was going to be considered, to violate to be an exception to the free speech, which is constitutional. So it's a very strong, symbol. And in this case, this robot or this cleaner is using it to clean the bathroom floor. So how did people react? And here, we're able to flip some important dimensions. Look at, the dimension of moral, which is, where the action is morally right or wrong. And it's morally right to the right and morally wrong to the left. In this case, people find the action of the machine more morally correct than the action of the human. People like the machine more than they like the human. Not because they like machines that clean bathroom floors with, flags, but because they dislike humans that do that much more. So we're starting to see also that there is variation depending on the moral dimension that you're triggering. In the scenarios that involve harm, for the most part, and if you look at the book, I'm going to show you in this presentation about like 20 scenarios. The book has over 80. You're going to see that if a scenario involves physical harm, machines are not going to do very well. But in scenarios that involve moral dimensions that are more difficult to compute, to process, like fairness, loyalty, authority, sometimes you can reverse this effect. So let's go and look at some of those. Let's look at algorithmic fairness. So algorithmic fairness is complicated and it's controversial, and in part is because it's one of these like no free lunch theorem, impossibility theorem type of problems. Yeah, you have something that you can define in multiple ways, and you cannot satisfy all of those ways simultaneously. So you have multiple ways to define fairness in a system. You can try to equalize the true positive rate, the false positive rates, and so forth, anything on a confusion matrix, any type of marginal that you can make, and you cannot guarantee fairness across all of those dimensions simultaneously. So you have an impossibility theorem that tells you that no matter what definition of fairness you use and you maximize, there's going to be another definition of fairness that you're not going to be able to maximize simultaneously. Now, in our case, we're interested in something that is a little bit simpler, which is how people judge a machine or a human that was caught in an unfair action or that was involved in correcting an unfair action. So consider a human resource screening scenario. It triggers the moral dimension of fairness here, straight up. A company replaces their HR manager with a new manager algorithm tasked with screening candidates for job interviews. There is an unfair treatment in which an audit reveals that the new manager algorithm never selects Hispanic, African American, or Asian candidates with the same qualifications, or there is a fair treatment in which the audit reveals that the manager or algorithm produces a more fair process for minority candidates. Yeah, so, scenarios S19, S20, and 21, there was an unfair action on S22, S23, S24, a fair action or action that corrected an unfair situation. We can do the same with college admissions, policing, salary increases, you name it. The results are going to be basically the same, so I'm just going to show you, one example of them. Here, when we look at the unfair treatment, what you're going to see first is that in the moral dimension of harm there, in this case for Hispanic and African American minorities, people judge the action of the human as causing a little bit more harm than the action of the machine. So again, we're in a situation in which the human is judged a little bit more harshly. We also find in the moral dimension, people find the human is doing something that is morally worse than the machine that have done the same. But for the most part, the differences are kind of small. The p-values are 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 3. They're just, inching away from each other. So the differences are relatively small, but, in this scenario that involves the moral dimension of fairness, again, we observe that people judge, the action of humans more harshly, and that's in large part mediated by the fact that people expect a person that is involved in an unfair action to be aware of it. They don't think of this as kind of like some sort of unconscious process. They see it as intentional. They see it as largely intentional. Now in the fair treatment, here the machine or the human did great. There was a situation that was unfair. Now they've corrected that unfairness. And even though they see the action of the human as more intentional, they don't reward the human more. This is not like the tsunami scenario. They rate them, morally as right as the machine. They like it the same. They of course want to replace the machine, but we know that always happens. There is an aversion, to machines that involves replacement. So I want to point out two things, in this chapter. The first one, is when you compare the unfair treatment and you look at that replaced by different question. Would you replace the machine by a human or a human by a machine? When you compare across, these two types of scenarios, you find that people are slightly more likely to want to replace a machine that increased fairness than a human that caused something unfair. Okay? So this is a very strong statement for this algorithmic aversion. Yeah? Here we have a machine that was brought into a system that was unfair, made it more fair, and people still want to replace, that machine with a human more strongly than they would want to replace a human that was caught causing an unfair situation with a machine. Okay? The second thing that I wanted to notice, is the fact that here the differences are kind of small. Because that also, has an interpretation. And these small differences, tell us that in this case, intent is not a strong predictor of judgment in these fairness scenarios. In other scenarios, intent, in some way correlated with judgment, but in these fairness scenarios, it doesn't. And this corresponds to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is an act that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. And the Supreme Court, affirmed Title VII in 1971 unanimously in a class action lawsuit that indicated that independent of intent, discriminatory outcomes for protected classes violated Title VII. So it's not the intent to discriminate, but the act of discriminating, the one that would be punishable, according to this law and according to the ratification by the Supreme Court of the United States. So the judgment that we observe here is aligned, with the judgment of the 1971 court and with the Civil Rights Act. Intent doesn't seem to be a strong mediator of judgment in scenarios involving the moral dimension of fairness. Now I'm going to go to chapter 4 that looks at privacy. Okay? So these scenarios, look at situations in which people are being observed by machines or humans. So you look at a school that is looking to improve attendance and the attention of its students, and the board decides to hire, people or facial recognition systems to observe the students during classes and track the attendance, emotions, and attention of each student. Okay? So there is one school in which you have kind of like one person sitting down observing the students. You have another school in which you have a camera, and a piece of software doing the same. Now, let's look at a similar scenario, but in a different context. An airport management team is seeking to increase security. To do so, the management team decides to equip the airport with security officers, facial recognition cameras that will register the face of everyone who enters the airport and track their movements. So in one case, they're being followed by people. In another case, they're being followed by cameras and software. And we ask people, how comfortable they are with the systems, how morally wrong or right they think their systems are. Do you think this solution violates people's privacy? Would you recommend this system to a friend? Would you use this system, and so forth? When we look at the school scenario, we find that basically people are much more comfortable with human observers, and they find machine observers to be more of a, not morally correct, but they judge it even more harshly when it's a system in which people are turning on each other instead of a system that involves machine-like observation. This is the last chapter that has scenarios. Then we're going to look into the statistics, and it's a chapter about automation. So you see that we've been going through kind of like some sort of hot topics in AI ethics, algorithmic bias, privacy, now automation. But the fears of automation are not new. Like in some sense, these fears of automation have been there all along. They were there during the first industrial revolution. They were there also during the first AI revolution. Actually, some people credit, this fear of automation to be one of the causes of the first AI winter that happens after the 1950s and 60s, when, many articles, claimed that jobs were going to disappear and machines were going to take over the labor force. And those fears of automation were revived recently, or not so recently anymore, by a paper, from a couple of people from Oxford that predicted that 50% of all jobs could be automated in the future. The problem is that that paper did not pass muster because there have been many studies since that have produced much more reasonable estimates and pointed out to the mistakes of that methodology. So the first thing is that, technology is not only a substitute to labor, it's also a complement. So it increases aggregate demand. It can increase the need for jobs too. The most important thing though, and this is what Frey and Osborne got wrong, is that jobs are not automated. Tasks are automated. And if tasks are the ones that are automated, jobs do not disappear. Jobs are transformed. So for instance, now that many restaurants have QR codes that you can use, to get the menu. That was very common in China even before COVID. And it went beyond what we're doing here, which is just to get the menu. You can use also the phone to pay your bill. So that means the waiter doesn't need to present you the menu, doesn't need to take your order because you take the order through your phone, doesn't need to bring you il conto because you can get that, you can settle that in your phone. But the waiter did not disappear. The waiter still brings you the plate. If you need to accommodate a larger party, they help you. So you see, there's some tasks that the waiter used to do that now became part of technology, and the job was transformed instead of disappear. A similar story from the 1980s is the automatic teller machines, the bancomáticos in the United States. So when they were rolled out in the 80s, a lot of people thought that the job of the bank teller was going to disappear. And the truth is that the number of bank tellers in the US grew over time because, bancomáticos made banking more accessible to people. There were all sorts of changes in regulation that allowed banks to become national in between, But long story short, the number of bank tellers grew over time, because the ATMs ended up being more of a complement than a replacement, to the bank teller. The bank teller now doesn't need to be, someone that is busy taking $60 out of your checking account. Is reserved for more important transactions. These other smaller transactions get done, at the ATMs. There's also, no evidence that tech reduces the need for labor in the long run. If you go back 150 years ago, like 80% or more of the population were involved in agriculture. Those jobs, now are gone. Like less than 5% of the population in many countries is involved in agriculture. But, there's not, 80% unemployment. Like people found other activities. So these changes in technology, like the mechanization of agriculture, did not, for instance, reduce the need for labor in the long run. But there is a reasonable fear that sometimes technology can precarize work, can basically create jobs that are of low quality, Think of the people that are delivering, for these apps, sometimes they have very precarious work conditions in terms of benefits, in terms of the labor conditions, and so forth. Now, what we're going to do here is going to see how people react to replacement by machines or replacement by, in this case, humans. Thank you. Grazie. Thank you. Okay. So we have a trucking company that is looking to hire, a temporary that is looking to lower their cost. On the one hand, they decide to bring temporary foreign drivers. On the other hand, they decide to bring autonomous trucks. This helps reduce the cost, but several people lose their jobs. So we present people kind of like these scenarios, like if they would be reading headlines in the news. We do the same with a chain of hotels, with a nuclear plant, with schools. And, we ask people, well, would you approve of this change? Would you ban it? Would you find it's morally right or wrong? Would your opinion of this company worsens or improve? Do you think others approve? Would you have done the same in a similar situation? And in the case of the trucks, we see that basically machines don't do well. People don't approve, machines do quite well. People approve of, autonomous trucks more than they approve of foreign drivers. People want to ban foreign drivers much more than they want to ban autonomous trucks. People find that, autonomous trucks are more morally correct than foreign drivers. But when we look at these other scenarios, we see that the effect starts reducing. So we go to the hotels, the effect is there, it's smaller. When we go to the nuclear power plant, the effect is basically disappearing. When we go to the schools, the effect is gone, but in these cases, people don't like either. They don't like foreign teachers and they don't like robot teachers. So in the case of the nuclear power plant, we have kind of like a bit of a gradient in which as we move to an activity of larger sophistication, of higher complexity, we basically, tend to be more accepting of foreigners as a replacement, while in activities that would be, considered to be of lower complexity, then, we basically want to protect more of our local labor force, except when it's considered a technological change that might be considered inevitable. We look at a number of other forms of replacement, in a large number of different scenarios, law firms, software companies, hospitals, and so forth, involving machines and involving, foreign workers with visas, younger workers replacing older workers, offshoring, outsourcing, and so forth. And for the most part, people react more strongly to foreigners and to replacing older workers with younger workers. That seemed kind of like more discriminatory. And offshoring is the one that rates closer to the machine together with outsourcing. Offshoring is when you open a foreign subsidiary, so you keep people in the same firm, but they're working on another location. So now let's try to put all of this together. And this is going to be the last part of the presentation, which is chapter 6. And we're going to try to model what we saw across the scenarios. We saw many different scenarios, but we have looked at them one by one. We look at a scenario, we look at people's reactions. Now, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to create statistics, first descriptively, and then using regression to try to understand how people rate machines and humans. So first, for the descriptive statistics, we're going to take 3 key dimensions of moral judgment, how people rated on a scenario in terms of harm, intention, and wrongness. I want to put 2 dots, a red dot for the way in which people rated the machine, and a blue dot for the way in which people rated the human. I want to connect them with a line because we want to keep track of which blue dots correspond to which red dots. And what we've obtained, of course, it's a chart as you would see here, where all of the points are more or less in kind of like this plane in the middle, and that's because there are some forbidden corners in morality. Yeah, you cannot have something that is done with a lot of intention and causes a lot of harm, and people think that is right. In that case, people are going to think that is wrong. Yeah, so there's some corners that you cannot occupy. But let's look at these phases one by one. So if you look at the top phase, here you have the harm intention plane. And what you see is quite interesting that when you look at the blue dots, you see that they're either at the top or either at the bottom. So at the top, they're on top of the red dots, and on the bottom, they're on the bottom of the red dots. So the intention of humans is being judged bimodally. People are judged as either doing something intentional or it is an accident. But machines are judged unimodally in this sort of intermediate level. And basically what that tells you is that in scenarios that you can attribute intention, humans are going to be seen as doing things that are more intentional as machines. But in scenarios that are accidental, it is the machines, the ones that are going to have a residual level of blame or intention compared to a human. When we look at the next plane, we look at the intention-wrongness plane, we see that, of course, as intention grows, the level of wrongness funnels up. You cannot do something very right by accident or very wrong by accident. Like intention is a modifier of moral judgment. Intention doesn't make something good or bad, but increases the intensity of something good and something bad. And at low levels of intention, you see here that wrongness is higher for machines than for humans. Like the red dots tend to be, for the most part, on top of the blue dots. Now, for scenarios that have intention, they are on the right. Now, intention starts to correlate with wrongness. High intention, for bad scenarios means more wrongness. High intention for good scenarios means less wrongness. And finally, when we look at the harm-wrongness plane, we see a correlation. If a scenario involves more harm, people think it's worse. But for instance, again, when you look at scenarios that involve low levels of harm, machines, again, are being judged severely. So they're being judged as worse than humans that did exactly the same. Even though many of these lines are vertical, meaning that there was no difference in the perceived level of harm, but people basically see some sort of insult to injury in the case of the machine. Now, these charts that I showed here, they make no assumptions, in terms of statistics. They're completely descriptive. So they're free from any type of assumptions. Now we're going to go to statistical models, and here we have to do a little bit more of assumptions. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 models predicting the wrongness of a scenario as a function of intention, harm, an interaction term, fixed effects, and we're going to do scenarios for humans and for machines. Now, the fixed effects are going to help us control for any individual level characteristic. If there was a person that was too judgy, or a person that was very lenient, or there difference between men and women, or there difference between people from different ages, that's all captured, by the subject fixed effects. So what we're able to do is to recover, the effect of harm, intention, on wrongness in a way that is independent from those individual level characteristics. You can look at the full tables in the book, but the summary of the functions that we obtain are this one. So on red, you see like a function predicting how wrong people would rate a scenario as a function of its perceived level of harm and intention when that scenario was performed by a machine. And on blue, you see a function predicting the level of wrongness that people would attribute to a scenario as a function of the level of harm and intention that they attribute to it when that scenario was performed by a human. And the first thing that you should notice is that these planes are not parallel. Yeah? The blue plane has this sort of curvature that the red plane doesn't have. The red plane tends to be flat, and basically it grows along the harm dimension, but not so much across the intention dimension. So when you look at the way in which people judge, machines, basically what you find is that they only care about the outcome, and it's this harm dimension, the one that dominates, the judgment. The prediction, all of the coefficient is there. You know the level of harm, you're going to know the level of wrongness. But when you see how people judge a human, is this diagonal the one that really matters? Is this interaction term between intention and harm? And what that causes is that when the levels of intention are relatively large, the planes are quite similar, but that corner there on the back, we have a huge difference. We have a difference of like about 0.2 in a scale that goes between 0 and 1, which are scenarios in which there's no intention and a lot of harm. So in accidents, we have a big difference, and that difference translates into people judging machines much more harshly than humans in accidental scenarios. So this goes again to the fact that people judge humans and machines using different moral philosophies. We're judging machines using a moral philosophy that is consequentialist. What was the outcome? And we're judging humans using a moral philosophy that was more based on intentions, motivations, a little bit more Kantian, if you may. Finally, we're going to look at some demographic correlates of the judgment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use fixed effects for the scenarios, and we're going to now look at how the demographic characteristics of the participants modify their judgment. So do women and men judge these scenarios equally? Do people that self-report as religious or not judge them the same? How does the level of education of the subjects that participated in this experiment affect the way in which they judge humans and machines? And I want to show like a few examples, But the first thing that I want to notice is the size of these effects, because like people sometimes get tripped up by this type of things. So here you have distributions, and of course when the distributions don't touch each other, the differences are highly statistically significant. But if you look at the size of these effects, they're very small, So one thing is significance, another thing is the size effect. When we go backwards, there we had a difference of 0.2. Here we have a difference at most of 0.05 or 0.1, So they're very small differences in comparison, to the ones that we observed before. Nevertheless, we find, for instance, when we compare by gender, and we ask, would you replace a machine by a human, or would you replace a human by a machine? Well, men are more likely to want to replace a human by a machine, and less likely to want to replace a machine by a human. So you could say, to simplify this, that men would be more machinophilic. They would like machines more, and women would be more human-philic in this example. But the difference, as I say, is significant, but it's not the one that determines the effect. The effect of the scenario is the primary effect. The effect of demographics is secondary effect. It's like if you would do it in music, it would be like a higher order harmonic. Now, level of education has an effect in a similar direction. As people become more educated, they become a little more technophilic. And religiousness has a bit of the opposite effect. People that are they report as religious. We didn't ask from which religion, just yes or no. Do you consider yourself religious? They're more machinophobic or human-philic in that case. So I want to conclude, by going back to the beginning and say, well, we started this presentation by asking if people see a machine or a human making the same mistake. Do they get the same reaction? Hopefully I convince you that the answer is no. People judge humans and machines differently. We don't judge them the same. And those differences actually are quite structured. People judge humans by intentions and machines by their outcomes. This is a simplification of of those charts that I showed you before, that is to say that people judge machines using a moral philosophy that is much more consequentialist, and humans with a moral philosophy that's based on intentions, motivation. Also, we saw that people judge the intentions of humans more bimodally and those of machines unimodally. And for example, these two ideas, have corollaries or consequences. They involve the fact that people are more forgiving of humans in accidental situations, and more judging of machines in those accidental situations. They also, people can be a little bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, like the ones of algorithmic bias or labor displacement. Those were scenarios in which people tended to judge the humans a little bit worse. They didn't want the foreigners, they preferred the trucks. They were not so kind, to the humans that were seen committing an unfair act than to machines. People also tend to find more harm in violent scenarios involving machines. So if there's physical harm involved, people tend to judge machines quite harshly in that case. And we saw also examples in which people take machine success or improvement more for granted. So when the machine gets it right, it's sort of, well, we expect the machine to just get it right. We don't want to give it more responsibility. We don't think that that's something special. When a human gets it right, it gets rewarded. So we're not so keen on rewarding, machines when they get things right. The book is available in print. It's also available if you teach online or you want to have material. We prepared the book as a sequence of 30 video episodes, that are about like 5 minutes each. So you can have, like, for instance, like I use them on a class in which I have the students watch the videos before class, then we discuss them, together with other papers and so forth. There's a free resource as well. And, the book is available from MIT Press, but it's also completely available to download for free at judgingmachines.com. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So who wants to start asking questions? Vladik Krajinovic? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I was just, as I heard you, I started kind of introspecting, because I think, to me, and I think that may be one of the reasons why you got these results, why do we have machines in the first place? Why do we have, because the idea is the only reason why we have a machine is because they're better than humans. That was the argument for cars, so it's kind of, they don't tire, they don't have like inherited biases, and so naturally, if a machine does something right, we expect that. Is that what you come up with, or it kind of goes beyond that? I mean, kind of.
No, I think, I hope I showed that it goes beyond that we have like, different, moral philosophies at play, and that moral philosophies that actually, just to expand a little bit, they're connected to the mental models that we have of the entities that we're judging. So at some point in the presentation, I show you like this 2x2 chart in which, we see agency and we see, the experience, the ability to feel, or the ability to act. And with some machines, we're seeing kind of like at the bottom in the center, as having agency but no status. So we have a subsequent experiment that we wrote, we submitted recently with one of my grad students, in which we modify the level of agency and experience that people perceive about machines, and we're able to bring machines closer to the way in which people judge humans if we manipulate people to believe that they're judging a machine that is more human-like or less human-like, and in particularly based on agency. So it's not that we just expect machines to work, and therefore, that would explain this change of moral philosophy. Even for different machines, based on the mental mold that we're making of them, we're changing, in a continuum space of moral philosophies from one that is more consequentialist to one that is more based on motivation.
More questions? Yes, Dominique, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fantastic talk, really very insightful. Let's imagine that a machine makes a mistake. but we are able to, or machine is able to explain why this mistake took place. And there are such approaches, such methodologies in explainable AI, which could be adapted for this, for providing explanation. Would it change the perception, or is it something completely irrelevant? If the machine can explain why it made a mistake, would it change the perception among humans?
That's a great question, you know. So there are a few papers by a colleague in Chicago, Berkeley Ditvorst, that he has been looking at something quite similar to that, which is, you know, how people judge machines if they see them err or they don't see them err. So what they have are experiments in which you have people that have a certain amount of money that they can invest in this sort of investment game. So you have to, you know, provide this money to like a fund manager, or, you know, so they would invest it for you and you get a return. At the end of the experiment, you get money. So there is kind of like an incentive to really care about the outcome of the experiment. And they have different conditions. In some conditions, you know, you see that there is a human manager or there is a machine manager, and they tell you, look, this is the performance of their funds, you know, and you can invest on them, you know. And then there's another condition in which you also get to see not only the performance, but the investments that they made and whether they got the investment right or wrong. So you, in some sense, start explaining that performance, saying like, look, this guy bought Tesla at the wrong time or at the right time, you know, like you would have kind of like that explanation. And they find, which is kind of paradoxically, that people tend to avoid the machine more in the case that they see the explanation, you know? And what they hypothesize, what they explore there, is that in some sense, we, like humans, we're a little bit full of ourselves, you know? And especially when we're dealing with an agent that has no moral status like a machine. So, you know, if a machine makes 10 right picks and 1 wrong pick, the human, you know, says like, I would have never, you know, bought Chuck E. Cheese stock in, I don't know, 2017. We overinterpret our ability to beat machines, you know, in situations in which we're not. So when the machine got it right, we think that we would have gotten it right too. And when the machine got it wrong, we think that, of course, we wouldn't have made that mistake, when the reality is not true. You know, so as far as I can tell, that's not exactly addressing fully your question, but I think it provides some good insight that it's not an explanation in the sense of providing a logic to the decision, but it is an explanation in the sense of at least decomposing, you know, an aggregate into components. And in that case, when people see the machine err, and they see why they err, they tend to avoid it more than if they just see the aggregate.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I have a question. So you showed the planes of human judgment and explained that there's a different philosophy behind the moral philosophy to explain this behavior. You also showed a graph where you plotted the sense of agency for both machines and humans, but also God. I was thinking, did you check whether the moral philosophies are a function of the sense of agencies, and therefore do you think the results that you present here are static, or are they also evolving over time, and as machines get more sense of agency, are the way we interpret or judge them will differ as well?
Yeah, so that's, I was commenting on this paper that we submitted recently in which we exactly do that. So we basically present people with, you know, scenarios. But before we present it with the scenarios, we present with a description of the agent. So we talk about Alice, and for some people, Alice is a human, you know, and for other people, Alice is a machine that is very capable, and scientists believe that is sentient and all of that. Other people are presented with Alice, a machine that is very mechanical and primitive, you know, and we use that to manipulate people's perception of, you know, the agency and experience of machines, and we find that agency seems to mediate people's judgment, and as people judge a machine as having a larger capacity for agency, they judge it also more similar as they would have judged a human in the same situation. So it's not kind of like machines and humans, there's kind of like some sort of continuum you know, at least that we mapped in 2 dimensions on mental models, you know, and humans and machines sit on different parts of this continuum, but it seems that you can like move one to the other. Now, a very hard space to map, you know. We don't know that at some points there are like some steps, you know, along the way or discontinuities, but for what we find is like at least at first order, as the machine becomes more human-like, the judgment also becomes more human-like.
Thank you. And do you think that this kind of manipulation has something to do with empathy? Once you have a better understanding of the machine, you are more able to somehow feel some empathy with the machine, or not?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know like how I would test if, you know, or at least from the top of my head, I don't want to venture some sort of, you know, BS explanation of whether empathy is the one at play here or not, because I wouldn't know exactly how to test it, so I prefer to just claim ignorance. Yeah. Thanks.
So thank you for a very interesting presentation, but I think I can find a lot of fault with perhaps the methodology. It's evident now that when women think of humans, they think of man and woman, or woman and man. But when men think of humans, they think of men. So both the person in the scenario and the person as a respondent are gendered. And I think this bears a lot of information on the outcomes of these scenarios and responses, but you did not take that into consideration. So the whole issue of gender is very little dealt with in your presentation, a couple of times. And I think this has a lot of importance in this particular type of moral judgment. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, would you care to speculate how the results would change? Yeah.
So intention, blame, harm, and all sort of loaded dimensions are judged very differently for men and women. So,
but we have fixed effects for that, so we could accommodate for beyond men and women. We could accommodate for 17 different or 20 different categories, because you know what a subject fixed effect means in a model, yeah?
If a woman driver was judged by women and men to be responsible for the accident, how would this come out?
And you would expect, like, let's say if we would consider these dimensions, you would expect that gender would make people judge humans more like they judge machines, or machines more like they judge humans. How do the moral philosophies would map there?
I would not like to impose my preconceptions on your research. I would like to see the outcome of that conflation, of that conflicting or conflating variable being taken into consideration.
Okay, and the fact that all of the demographic variables were second order in magnitude would give you still a reason to believe that they're first order, like in your comment, or?
I would say so, yes. But
why?
Of course, I would like to see that. Because we as men tend to overlook these things, and after a number of experiments, it's been seen that they are really relevant. But
they're the most relevant, or they're the relevant, or like because you have orders of magnitude, yes, in effects.
At the very least, they're relevant, but I think they might be really relevant.
Maybe that's a line of research that you could take.
I'm not a social scientist, sorry, but I'm interested in gender issues in technology.
Okay, but not scientifically, not to study scientifically. Because you said you're not a social scientist, but you're interested on those issues that usually study. So you're interested scientifically on them, or you're interested more colloquially on them? Yeah.
You mean as a person?
You know,
yes.
yeah, but not scientifically, like to study them.
No, I'm very interested scientifically. I'm just not the person. I'm not the type of scientist that should do that research.
Sorry. Inspired by your answers, another question. Did you try to distinguish, for example, the question of blame would be different, for example, in case of the accident, whether it's a driver with a lot of experience or a novice driver? And did you try that? And maybe that will be another way to kind of to have a continuum going to the machine.
No, that's a good question. You know, like we thought a lot about different extensions. You know, on terms of, for instance, experience, or in terms of like rates. You know, at which, let's say, rate people start preferring human and machine. Let's say if you're doing like a surgery with a certain, you know, probability that a patient would die or would have a serious complication. And the problem with that is that each one of these experiments is relatively expensive to run, you know, because we have to hire subjects, we have to prepare the stuff, we have to collect the data. So any extension of the experiment that would involve, you know, like some sort of, you know, continuous variable disaggregation was something that we decided to leave for later. So now we're working on some of those extensions in papers, you know, and we use a reduced set of scenarios. We don't use 80 scenarios anymore. We have like now a group of 12 scenarios that map this space a little bit more sparsely, but keeps it, you know, manageable, because unfortunately, like working with human subjects, it's expensive in terms of, you know, cost, but also expensive in terms of time, that every protocol has to be approved to the human subjects committee of the university, which can take months and so forth. So we have to take it slowly, but I do think that's, you know, an interesting question, like the level of experience and what would experience would mean in a machine. You know, is the experience on training it? Is it the experience, you know, on the road in the case of a self-driving car? Yeah.
Well, can I ask a question then?
Sure.
I ask before you and then you. Okay. Well, maybe this is not nice. Right?
So I had a question. So that was quite interesting. Thank you. My question is, how do you ensure that your questions are relevant? Or do you ensure that you don't anthropomorphize too much machine, that comparing machine and humans in this way is relevant? So I would make an analogy with people trying to test intelligence in animals. Usually when you want to test intelligence in animals, a common mistake is to try to test animals with tests designed for humans, which is irrelevant because clearly animals have different brains and they react differently and they have maybe different ways of perceiving the world and having intelligence. So does this kind of considerations enter into your development and judgments? And is there not a risk to anthropomorphize machine too much? Because they are clearly different from humans. And you make them comparable to humans.
Okay. Yeah. So we're not judging whether the machine is intelligent. We're judging people to a scenario. Yeah.
You speak of intentions, which is not that far from sentience and all these things. So that's is it something that enters into the research you're doing?
So on the research design, there's a few things. The first one is that it's a between subject and between treatment and control type of setup. So the people that looked at scenarios involving machines never saw a scenario involving a human. You know? So if a subject was recruited to the experiment and evaluated the scenarios in machine conditions, that subject was never recruited for an experiment involving a human condition. So that avoids kind of like some cross-contamination of, oh, I evaluated this here, now I evaluated there, and so the people doesn't know that there's another group of people doing another experiment. For them, they're just doing kind of like a one-time survey, and it has just one type of scenarios, you know, and so forth. The other thing is, as I was saying before, we're not necessarily like judging the ability of a machine. We're presenting people with scenarios that would read it on the press, you know, and we're kind of more looking at that perception in a context of public opinion of how people would react, not to a scenario that they have experienced or an interaction with a machine, but how they would react to a story about a situation that happened that they would read about or learn about indirectly, you know? And that's kind of like the scope of what we can look at there. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, wonderful presentation. And I want to ask, how do you measure wrongness, harm, and intention? And does it only refer to self-driving cars? I mean, automation of car case, or it's some other case?
So we measure all of these reactions using Likert scales, which are scales that would go from 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10. They have like clear labels. So let's say we will have a scenario that is extremely harmful, very harmful, harmful, a little bit harmful, and then we're not harmful at all, so forth. And people would rate, or react to each one of these scenarios using these Likert scales, and then we take averages of the population and confidence intervals to say, look, for the population, let's say they rate these scenarios as 0.7 of harm plus minus 0.1, so we would know that confidence interval. The scenarios involve more things than the self-driving cars. We had scenarios, with a robot cleaner. We had the scenarios on algorithmic privacy. We had scenarios on algorithmic bias, privacy, labor displacement in different situations, and so forth. Emergency response. So it was a wide variety, and that's what we tried to do with the book. There have been, for example, a lot of papers that have focused on self-driving cars alone, or others that have focused on particular things, but there was no volume that was comprehensive, and that was something that you could say, okay, I want a scenario of an extrajudicial killing. Where can I find it? And here in appendix, we have even more than 20 scenarios that we collected data for that don't make it into the main text, and we put it in the appendix. So that is to have kind of this sort of compendium. We started doing this book around 2018 when these topics were starting to heat up. And what we were finding is that a lot of the discussion that was out there did not have counterfactuals. So it was a discussion in which, car got into an accident and people react to it, but okay, how would they have reacted to a human that would have done the same? There was a system placed in court, that has this performance, in terms of, fairness across racial lines. Well, how would they have judged a judge that would have had the same performance? To me, that was the part that was missing. And to kind of make that inference, you want to have kind of that benchmark, because from a philosophical perspective, you can think that you can judge what you observe, the outcome, in this case, the accident, the judgment, or you can have a judgment that is, as an economist would call it, at the margin, which is this making the system better or worse, So it's not that it makes the system good or bad, because those are kind of a little bit black and white, but if it makes it better, it might be a way to improve over time, or if it makes it worse. And to do that, you have to compare with the benchmark. For us, the benchmark was, a system in which the alternative would be a human, and that's why we wanted to create that benchmark.
Well, just a short question. Well, no. Maybe not completely directly related to your experiment, but yesterday I think you were present in the talk by Tommaso Bocchio, and they were speaking. There were several questions around the notion of intelligence and the evolution of this notion during the time, and the comparison between artificial and natural intelligence. Also, consciousness was mentioned, and so ethics. So, well, both talks are somehow related from different perspectives. My question is, he gave his idea of what he thinks about intelligence and so, probably, his expert notion of it. You have also probably an expert notion as an artificial intelligence researcher. My question is, what do you think about, from those experiments, what do people think about those notions in machines? I mean, do you think that we have, people that are not trained in artificial intelligence have a clear idea or a similar idea as you experts have about the notions of intelligence, consciousness, and ethics for machines? I don't know if the question is
No, it's a good question, and it's clear. Yeah. So first of all, to answer the larger question, I think people in general, in the public, on average, my intuition from what I've seen is they have a very different notion than experts. And they tend to think of artificial intelligence in much more mechanical terms. So they tend to think of, that artificial intelligence are machines that are made on algorithms, which is something that they have heard of, and that algorithms are ways for people to give instructions to machines in almost a hard-coded way. So the idea that the machine has the ability to learn and could adapt and could, in the same situation, give you a different behavior because of past experience is something that flies over the head of most people. People think of machines like very much in a mechanical, like really physical context in which the machine is always going to do the same. And that's what I think we capture quite a bit here. Now, of course, since we're averaging across a lot of people and we randomize people, if there's people that think of machines as having more agency and ability to learn, and there's people that think of machines as having less agency and being completely mechanical, they have the same probability of being in the treatment or the control. So in our experiments, we're averaging across those groups, because of the setup, But in my experience, having given this talk, many times over the last 2 years, I've seen that, especially in more general audience groups, people have that mechanical idea, Now going a little bit more to your questions of like consciousness and, like where I see that sometimes kind of we fail, or for example, that Google engineer that went viral a few weeks ago saying that the machine was sentient, I did a thread also like to kind of like, explain a little bit like what I thought were some of the logical mistakes that he was making. But when I talk to GPT-3, when I talk to those machines that I have had access to and have conversations, and they're very useful, they're fun, they're entertaining to use and so forth, where to me you see the fact that there is nothing beyond the mechanical parrot yet, is that you can take the machine to whatever conversation you want. And when I talk to a human has an internal agency, an internal fire, a motivation. So when I talk to you, if you're not agreeing with me, you're going to disagree with me, and we're going to have a disagreement. Or if you have an agenda that you want to convince me about something, let's say, you want to convince me to become vegan, and you kind of start talking to me about, you have something that you want to accomplish, and you're trying to adapt the conversation, not to respond to what I say to you, but to fulfill that internal goal or motivation. So you're going to disagree, you're going to say no, you're going to change the topic, you're going to try to drive. And these AIs don't try to drive. So you say like, why did you commit the murder? And they're going to confess to the murder, because they're trying to please, And of course, they were trying to satisfy some sort of reward, so they're kind of like these people pleasers. But the fact that they're people pleasers tells you you don't have agency, because people are not always people pleasers. We try to be nice, we try to do stuff, but we also have our internal motivation, agenda, and goals. And if there's a way to kind of like test for that when you have these language models, that to me would be one of the things that I would want to try to formalize and extract to see if the machine is. Now, of course, knowing the test, people could start programming machines that try to fool that test, And then, it's an arms race. You have to become smarter about now how to protect yourself against that trick. But at this level, from what I've seen out there, that to me is the difference. The machine always pleases. The human has an internal agenda that they're going to push.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. I think we can close the session here because it's the time. Thank you so much again.